It's not always words or gestures that give away a hidden truth. Sometimes it's a sound. A single sound, like the dull thud of a suitcase hitting the floor. The moment I heard it, my chest tightened in a way that wasn't just concern. It was a premonition. I knew that sound. But more than that, I knew my son. And that hurried, clumsy way of throwing everything down was typical of someone who didn't want to be found out. A mother's instinct doesn't fall for excuses. Craig had always been good at crafting convincing stories. The kind that could fool a neighbor, a boss, even close friends. But never his own mother. While he darted from room to room, stuffing clothes into the suitcase, I stood still in the hallway watching. I didn't need an explanation. The rush, the heavy silence, the way he avoided my eyes. All of it said, I'm running away, not going on a trip. There are moments when the truth doesn't arrive with shouting or tears, but with the sound of zippers closing and doors slamming. It's in those small details that the biggest secrets hide. I stood there, steady, without theatrics. I had already understood everything before a single word was spoken. What I didn't know yet was how far that escape would drag everyone around it. Before we go on, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to Vintage Revenge Stories. We're building a community of amazing women who know our best chapters can happen at any age. Now back to the story. He walked straight past the living room as if he didn't see the black and white photo of his wife smiling above the fireplace. He didn't reach for it, didn't linger, didn't even sigh with nostalgia. He just muttered, I need to breathe, as if that house were a prison, not the place that had held our family together when the world collapsed. That's when I realized, he wasn't leaving out of necessity. He was running away. And he was doing it with the coldness of someone who had been gone on the inside for a long time. Mason was sitting on the stairs, holding the toy he carries everywhere. His eyes were silently pleading for attention, for an explanation, for something to make sense. But Craig said nothing. He didn't kneel, didn't kiss him, didn't promise to come back. He just picked up the suitcase and placed the weight of raising his own son squarely on my shoulders. As if it were natural. As if I, once again, were expected to fix what he broke. I didn't complain. I didn't cry. It wasn't the first time Craig had hidden behind pretty excuses to justify abandonment. But it hurt to see his own son treated as a burden. I knew real love is quiet but steady. It's the one that stays when everyone else leaves. And at that very moment, one truth filled me completely. Mason was mine now. Entirely mine. And I would not let that emptiness grow inside him the way it had inside his father. I expected anything. A muffled cry, a desperate plea, a "Why are you going, Dad?" But Mason just looked at him and said, "Okay," in a calm voice as if he had rehearsed that line his whole life. No tremble, no glimmer in his eyes, not even anger. That broke me more than any dramatic scene could. Because when a child learns not to expect anything from the person who should be everything, something inside them has already been broken for a long time. Mason was only 13, but in that moment he seemed to carry decades on his back. He stood at the door without a fuss, as if silently saying, "I knew you wouldn't stay." And I understood. He wasn't being strong, he was protecting himself. Building an inner shell so he wouldn't feel that same wound again. The kind that burns without bleeding. His maturity was beautiful to see, but painful because it hadn't come from life. It had come from absence. As Craig turned his back, my heart screamed inside, but I didn't let it show. I wanted to run to Mason, hold him, promise that nothing else would ever be taken from him. But I knew words weren't enough when what had left was a piece of something he had never fully had. And yet, something in that silent goodbye told me Mason would be different. That his own story was beginning right there. And I had to be ready to help him write it. The house was too quiet that night. It wasn't just the silence in the air. It was the kind of emptiness that settles into your bones as if the air itself had grown heavier. I sat at the edge of my bed trying to find some rest, but something felt off. That's when I heard it. A soft, repetitive sound. It was coming from Mason's room. And right then I knew he wasn't crying. He was awake. And more than that, he was doing something. I opened the door slowly and saw him there, the dim glow of the screen lighting his focused face. His bed was covered in scribbled papers, notes, open folders on the laptop. He wasn't playing games or distracting himself, he was investigating. Traces of his father, names, dates. Things I wouldn't even know where to start looking for. It scared me and impressed me at the same time. Mason didn't retreat into grief, he moved. He needed to understand why. And to do that he acted. Most kids would curl up under the blanket waiting for the pain to fade. Mason didn't. He wanted answers. And even without knowing exactly what he was looking for, he had already decided he wouldn't settle for half-truths. Seeing that broke my heart, but it also gave me a strange kind of hope. Maybe he wouldn't grow into a bitter man like his father. Maybe he would learn early on that seeking the truth is far more powerful than running from it. He came into the kitchen early in the morning, his eyes tired but his expression set, like someone carrying something heavy in his chest. He sat down, placed a folder in front of me and said, "I think you need to see this." When I opened it, my heart sank. Bank statements, account access logs, copies of transfers, and the truth neither of us had wanted to face. Craig hadn't just left. He had been draining everything long before he walked out. Mason's college fund, the one we had saved for with so much sacrifice since he was a baby, was gone. Not a cent left. Worse, my personal account where I had stored decades of work, making and selling crochet pieces, turning down trips and new clothes, was down to $12. I read that number at least 3 times before I could accept it was real. Craig had taken it all. He had done it while smiling at Sunday dinners, saying, "Thanks for the support, Mom," all the while planning the con. With tears welling in his eyes, Mason asked if he had done something wrong. If his father hated him. I held his hand and told him what every child needs to hear: none of this is your fault. But inside my blood boiled. Not because of the money, but because of the trust that had been betrayed. Because of the innocence ripped away from a boy who only wanted to study, to grow, to be proud of his own story. And that's when I realized we were no longer dealing with abandonment. We were dealing with betrayal. I wanted to believe Craig was just lost, that his escape was born of desperation, not calculated cruelty. But Mason didn't stop digging. Days later, he found a woman named Vanessa. A name too common to raise suspicion, but linked to suspicious bank transactions and cross-referenced with my son's personal records. She wasn't just an accomplice, she was a partner. She worked at a local finance company, using her position to facilitate the transfers without raising red flags. The more we uncovered, the worse it got. We found out Craig and Vanessa had opened accounts under fake names, created shell companies, and were on the verge of disappearing completely off the radar. They weren't just escaping. They were building a new life with the money they had taken from me, from Mason, from our story. It was as if, to him, nothing we had lived together mattered. As if everything had been just a stepping stone to something bigger. For him. It was hard to accept that all of it had been planned in the shadows while I made coffee for him, while Mason proudly showed his school grades. The worst part was that Vanessa seemed to know exactly what she was doing. She wasn't some deceived woman, she was an active, cold, efficient player in all of it. And the more we discovered, the clearer it became that the hole was deep. And if we wanted justice, we'd have to go beyond the pain. The question now was, how far did this network go? When I realized there was no one else we could trust to help, Mason decided he would do something himself. Alone, he began studying digital security, browsing through forums, videos, and tutorials that taught how to protect data and trace online movements. It was astounding to see someone so young dive into such a complex world with the determination of an adult who refuses injustice. He didn't want to be a victim. He wanted to be the protagonist of his own story. Day after day, he saved and organized every file, every email, every suspicious transfer he found. He built a detailed dossier, a kind of treasure map of everything Craig and Vanessa were trying to hide. But it wasn't vengeance driving Mason. It was a search for truth. A thirst for justice that came from deep within. He wanted the world to know this wasn't just a father abandoning his child. It was a real crime with real consequences. I found myself admiring that boy who, even in the face of pain, refused to be paralyzed. He showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. And as he quietly built that plan, I realized we were beginning to turn the game around. We just didn't know yet how much it would demand from us. As the house sank into the silence of night, Mason was far from resting. He sat in front of the computer, eyes locked on the screen, fingers flying across the keyboard as if every second was worth an eternity. He knew this was his only chance to act without being discovered. Carefully, he began sending fraud alerts to the banks, notifications to financial institutions, and even direct reports to the company where Vanessa worked. It was a silent attack, but a deadly one. I watched from a distance, unable to interfere, feeling a mix of pride and fear. pride because my grandson, even at his young age, had a courage many adults couldn't even dream of. Fear because I knew that going up against dangerous people could have unexpected consequences. But Mason had no doubts. He was fighting for justice, and he wasn't about to let anyone cover up the truth any longer. That night was an invisible turning point to anyone on the outside. But for us, it was the beginning of something much bigger. The boy's courage began to shine light where there had only been shadows, preparing the ground for what was to come. And I knew the battle was far from over. The next morning my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Emails poured in one after another, each bringing a different confirmation. The accounts had been frozen, blocked so not another cent could vanish. Vanessa was suspended from her job as the investigations began to take shape. It was like watching justice finally move at the pace we had been waiting for so long, though we never imagined it would come this quickly. Mason looked at me with that calm smile, the kind only someone who has fought with everything they've got can wear. He wasn't celebrating out of revenge but out of justice. To prove that the truth, even when buried in the darkest corners, will always find a way to come to light. That victory wasn't just ours. It was for everyone who had ever felt the weight of betrayal and lies. As I filed away those emails, thinking about what still lay ahead, I felt a strange peace. A sense that, despite the scars, we were finally on the right path. And right there, in that moment, Mason and I knew this battle was only beginning because true justice is never quick or easy. Mason looked at me with a firmness I had never seen before. He said, "Grandma, Dad didn't just steal money. He tried to steal our future." It wasn't a complaint. It was a silent declaration of war, spoken by a 13-year-old boy. In that moment, I realized he wasn't looking for protection anymore. He had decided to be the protection. The shield. The guardian of our family despite his young age. I felt a mix of pride and responsibility. As a grandmother, I had always wanted to protect him from the world, from pain, from betrayal. But Mason showed me that sometimes, the ones who seem most vulnerable carry inside them a strength that surprises even the strongest among us. He didn't want to be a victim. He wanted to be a defender. A boy who learned far too early that, to survive, you have to fight. Not just for yourself but for everyone you love. That courage, so young and so pure, made me rethink everything I thought I knew about strength. Because it's not the absence of fear that defines us, but the choice to act in spite of it. And there, between tears and silent promises, I knew our story still had many chapters left, and that Mason would be the one holding the pen. After the storm, Mason looked at me and said with surprising calm, "It's time to get back what's ours." That simple sentence carried a force I never imagined hearing from someone so young. There was no anger or desperation in his voice, only a steady determination, as if he'd already been through so many battles that the only option left was to move forward, head high and heart steady. He began organizing everything, making plans with a maturity that left me in awe. While many adults get lost in the chaos of emotions, Mason knew that true victory comes from focus and strategy. This wasn't just a fresh start. It wasn't empty promises or wishful thinking. It was real reconstruction, step by step, built on courage and clarity. My chest filled with hope as I watched that boy take the lead for our family, taking control of a future someone had tried to steal. He was living proof that even in the worst storms, there's always a chance to be reborn. And in that moment, I knew the best was yet to come. The next morning, I woke to the comforting smell of fresh coffee coming from the kitchen. To my surprise, it was Mason in there, calmly preparing everything with an almost adult composure. As he stirred the pot, he spoke quietly about the next steps, the plans to recover what we had lost. It was such a simple ritual, but it was loaded with meaning. The true beginning of our rebuilding. He knew the fight was far from over, but he had a quiet faith that together we were unstoppable. In his eyes, I saw a mix of hope and courage that gave me the strength to keep going. That morning, the coffee felt like more than a drink. It was fuel for both our bodies and our souls, ready to face whatever came next. As we sat down for that modest meal, I realized that what was being built there went far beyond money or material things. It was a new life, a fresh start made of unity, trust, and an unshakable will to win. And there, in that moment, I knew we were ready for anything, together. As Mason continued his investigation, he uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Vanessa Torres, my son's accomplice, was no newcomer to the world of scams and fraud. She had a dark past marked by similar crimes. In her previous job, she had been fired for theft, And now it seemed she was repeating the same cruel scheme with Craig, deceiving elderly people and entire families who trusted her. It was hard to accept that someone could destroy so many lives in such a cold, calculated, and merciless way. Vanessa wasn't a victim of circumstances. She was an active part of the machinery that had torn our home apart. What hurt the most was thinking about how many other people like Mason and me had been betrayed by that woman, who used trust in her job to hide the true face of her crimes. Mason became even more determined after that discovery. For him, it was no longer just a personal matter. It was a fight against an injustice that hurt countless innocent people. And even with the pain and fear, he knew the truth had to come out, not just to save us, but to protect whoever might be the next victim of the dark past Vanessa insisted on repeating. While Craig and Vanessa tried to escape the truth, they began to realize that the life they had planned was already crumbling beneath their feet. Credit cards were being blocked one by one, bank accounts frozen without warning, and every rental offer for their new home vanished like smoke in the air. It was as if an invisible force was yanking the ground out from under them, carefully dismantling every step of their plan. Mason told me Craig had begun to sense the presence of someone mysterious behind this sudden downfall. A digital ghost that wouldn't leave him alone. He spoke with a mix of fear and frustration, suspecting that his past was finally coming back to make him pay for every wrong, every betrayal. It was a silent justice, discreet but relentless. And I knew this pressure was only just beginning to turn the game in our favor. Watching this battle play out in the virtual world made me realize how powerful information and technology can be as weapons against injustice. Mason, with his determination and skill, was proving that even a 13-year-old boy could change the course of a story that seemed lost. And as their life unraveled, our hope only grew. The news came like a silent thunderclap. Vanessa had been arrested. They caught her trying to open a new account with fake documents. I thought I would feel relief, maybe even joy, but what I felt was a knot in my chest. Mason, however, stayed calm. While I was still processing the news, he was already planning our next move. He said firmly, "Grandma, he's going to call you. When he does, keep him on the line. I've already notified the police." And he was right. Hours later, Craig called me. His voice was nervous, suspicious, trying to figure out how everything had fallen apart so fast. Inside I was shaking, but I obeyed. I kept the conversation light, stalling as much as I could. I asked how he was doing, if he needed any help. Lies disguised as care just to keep him talking. As I spoke, my eyes kept flicking to the clock, waiting for the moment that was no longer in my hands. Then I heard the sirens. On the other end of the line, his silence told me everything. Craig was arrested right then and there, for financial crimes, identity theft, and fraud. I hung up with trembling hands, feeling a strange mix of pain and relief. Mason just looked at me and said, "It had to be done." The boy I had raised was now more than my grandson. He was the bridge between the past that had wounded us and the future that was finally beginning to be born. As the dust began to settle and our days slowly returned to a calmer rhythm, I realized we were finally crossing that thin line between being victims and becoming survivors. Craig and Vanessa's arrest didn't erase everything we'd been through, but it marked the beginning of something that had long felt impossible: real justice. We received a court notice stating that part of the stolen funds would be returned to the victims. Small new beginnings, but they meant the world to those of us who had lost almost everything. The most surprising part was that justice in this case didn't come solely through punishment. It came with restoration. People who had been deceived, elderly individuals, simple families like ours, were finally having their voices heard. That gave back something far greater than money. It restored dignity. Every cent recovered carried with it a fragment of hope. It was as if at last someone had looked at us and said, "You matter." Mason watched it all unfold with a quiet composure, as if he'd known from the start this would be the outcome. When I looked at him, I saw more than just my grandson. I saw a living symbol of resilience. We had endured losses, wounds too deep to explain. But we survived. And now, with our hearts still patched together, we were starting to write a new chapter. Not as helpless victims, but as survivors who had come to understand their own strength. 6 months have passed since that dark chapter, and what Mason has built in that time leaves me speechless. He didn't just move on, he reinvented himself. He took everything he'd learned during those lonely nights, every hardship we endured, and turned it into something bigger than the both of us. A fraud protection company aimed at everyday people. People like me, people like you. And even more remarkable, at just 14 years old, he became the youngest certified specialist in the country. I'll never forget the day he showed me his printed certificate, his hands trembling, not from vanity, but from pride in having transformed pain into purpose. He began giving talks in schools, making online videos, helping entire families understand how to protect their data, their money, their peace. It was as if every word he spoke carried the message, "What happened to me won't happen to anyone else." And in that moment he stopped being just a boy, and became a mission. Watching my grandson rise from the ashes taught me more than any book, doctor, or counselor ever could. Mason showed me that no matter how deep the hole you've been thrown into, if you have the courage, you can dig your way out. And now, as I see him working, answering calls, studying digital protection laws, I understand that the greatest gift justice gave us wasn't the imprisonment of the guilty, it was the birth of a new leader. One ordinary afternoon the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but it was just familiar enough to freeze me in place for a few seconds. I knew exactly where that call was coming from. The prison. Craig. For a long time I had imagined this moment, expecting an apology, an explanation, maybe even a sign of remorse. But staring at the caller ID flicker, I realized it wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. About what I was willing to accept, and what I needed to refuse. I didn't answer. Not because I hate my son, but because I've learned that some bridges cannot and should not be rebuilt. Forgiveness is a two-way street, and to this day, Craig has never taken a real step toward repentance. He chose to run, to destroy, to betray. And now perhaps he was seeking comfort where there was no longer any space for it. Sometimes silence is the most just response. Because the absence of a reply can also say, "I chose peace." Mason watched me from across the room as he realized I wasn't going to pick up. He didn't say a word. He just smiled as if to say, "You're not alone." And in that small gesture, I felt something no phone call in the world could offer. Peace. The pain, the hurt, they still existed, but they no longer controlled us. Because in the end you learn that justice isn't just seeing the guilty pay. It's also knowing when it's time to stop looking back. These days the house is quieter than ever. But it's not the empty kind of quiet. It's a quiet full of purpose, occasionally broken by the steady sound of Mason's voice coming from the next room. He answers calls, listens to stories of hardship, and responds with calm, firmness, and empathy. Every sentence that leaves his lips is a hug to someone who once felt abandoned, just like we did. And I sit there in my armchair simply listening. Proud. People think justice only happens in courtrooms, in verdicts. But I've learned that justice can also come in the form of a conversation, a listening ear, or guidance that prevents another tragedy. Mason understood that far too early. He didn't just become a specialist in digital security, he became a specialist in empathy. The phone rings nonstop and he answers every single person with the same care. One call at a time, he's rebuilding the trust of entire families. Sometimes I close my eyes and just listen. That steady, warm voice that once belonged to a wounded boy now inspires courage. He became what his father never was. A man who stays. A man who protects. A man who cares. And every time he says, "You're not alone," I feel as though in some small way the world becomes a better place. More just, safer. Because my house may be simple, but from it flows a voice that is changing lives.